The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you.
An unreformed private insurance monopoly in this country.
By the military industrial complex.
Why is that a good thing for America?
Government is
the problem. You ain't in it.
Nor does the Congress have any control over this cartel.
All day long, beating you over the head in your meetings, telling you what to believe, what to think.
There is very grave danger.
Because less than 15% of you read newspapers. Because the only truth you know is what you get over the tube.
It's a business. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. They want obedient workers.
Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Crusade Against Bullshit. I'm your host, Todd Farino. Today is episode 4 of 10 of The Great Deception, the Conspiracy for a Counter-Revolution, as we are bringing back Crusade Against Bullshit. Of course, RC will be joining me after I finish my little series on this colossal conspiracy for our political system and really the counter-revolution against our own American Revolution that took place 240 years ago to this year. Last week on episode 3, we got all the way into the Lincoln assassination. And I pointed out to you parts of history that didn't really point this out, about the involvement of the Rothschilds and the English bankers in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, unlike the storybooks, or not, I don't want to call them storybooks, technically they're history books, that told you that it was John Wilkes Booth all by himself, just a Southern sympathizer, went out and killed the president. Not quite that simple, my friends. Not quite that simple. But then we kind of stopped there. But for this show, we've now put together this basically, 80 or so years of our history as a nation that we're into by the end of the Civil War. We've now fought a war against England, and we fought a Civil War, 2 major wars that we fought. The first one, of course, being the one War of 1812, which wasn't a war you really had to get into. It doesn't really make a lot of sense on both sides, but it did make sense a little bit for the bankers. We'll get into that a little bit later. But we're going to take a step back now, guys. We're going to take a step back. Again, I like to do this at the beginning of all the shows, take a step back, get into a little bit more detail, and tell you about a story of something else that was going on, of course, around that time. So we're going to go back a little bit and revisit the history that you should know. Okay, so far at this point in all the podcasts and the conspiracies, just how the bankers managed to infiltrate our political system and basically slime their way. I mean, if you look at the way they did, they slimed their way into our banking system. I mean, either with the first Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States, taking over political parties, as we showed you in the last couple of shows, how they started just picking the candidates for us, basically with the invention of Democrats. They already had the Federalists picked, but they said, forget this, we're just going to take both. So we're going to form another party, a profitable party with Martin Van Buren, and we're going to put up our war hero president, and don't worry, we'll run the show here. That's how they did it. They got what they wanted when they got Andrew Jackson, and they knew they were going to get that. The level of deception, though, deceit, and corruption is at levels never seen until this time. The fact that we are taught, all these things in history, but they never intersect is unimaginable. They just never intersect. Let's take a look. Okay, for number one, we are taught that throughout the last 1,500 or so years of European history that there have been kings, queens, and royal families. Okay, these families have spread from their ancient Roman heritage and ancestry to claim all the thrones of Europe, which is convenient. And in the process, they have gotten very rich over the past 1,500 years, ruling the richest continent in world's history. 2, we fought the American Revolution for 7 years and won. And so the King of England, of course, in 1783 just said, oh, I guess we won't rule America. Sure, folks. Sure, that's exactly what he said. The royal families in Europe were not at all happy with what occurred in France and or America. Okay? They weren't happy with that. And at the time, and certainly fought back to retain, at the very least, America. I mean, France is right there in Europe. They can handle their own European problems. So through the first 3 episodes, we have explained how they have answered our American Revolution with their own revolution. We covered all the ways up to Lincoln and the assassination, but as we do in all the episodes, we're going to, like I said, we're going to take this step now. We're going to go back in time just a few years, and we're going to get into detail about a few very, very critical points, critical things in history that occurred that show this conspiracy. That if you didn't put them together, you might not see it, but now you're going to see it. So let's take a step back now to this confusing time in history known as the 1830s, or even better yet, the bank wars. Dun, 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 dun. Anytime you put the word war in there, it's like, there's got to be a good guy, there's got to be a bad guy, right? There's got to be a good guy, there's got to be a bad guy. It's war. How about if they're both bad guys? How about if it's a war not of two sides necessarily, but maybe it's the two sides waging war to hurt the people in the middle, the civilians, the innocents. Let's take a look at this. So the Panic of 1837, I told you last show we were going to cover this. This is an incredibly important panic, as is the Panic of 1819, which we'll be discussing in detail in this episode. I mean, I can't believe how many panics there have been. And wait, I'm going to look at my producer, who's an imaginary producer. Did we have national central banks for both those panics? Oh, we did. Oh, and weren't national banks put there to stop things like panics? Oh, they were, but they didn't. Wait, but didn't the Federal Reserve get put into place because of the Panic in 1907, and it was supposed to prevent things like the Great Depression? Oh, it didn't prevent, but it's certainly supposed to prevent things like Black Monday. No? I mean, what about the crash in 2008? It had, really? Oh, it caused all those. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking to my imaginary producer and looking at a blank wall now and talk right to you folks. So let's get into, let's stop the sarcasm. The Panic of 1837 was really the first Great Depression in the United States history. I mean, some people might argue with me from 1819. They might argue with me. That was a pretty bad recession. It lasted until about 1824, but this one lasted until about 1842 to 1844. It really pretty much lasted to give or take a year. But how did the Panic of 1837 and the bank wars actually happen? You know, let's examine the details and not what they taught you in the history books. Let's start with the second U.S. bank. You know, the reason it was named that is because there was technically a first that Thomas Jefferson got rid of. But the second U.S. bank was chartered by one of his buddies, James Monroe, a Democratic Republican, Jeffersonian Republican, whatever you want to call him, Republican. So this whole thing about good guys, bad guys, it really starts to, once you start getting into the latter years and you start getting influences of the banks as they get more and more powerful into the 1800s, 1820s, 1830s, you start to see these politicians pretty much just meld together. Let's get back to it, though. So, and the sole reason for the issue that James Monroe actually allowed, against the better wishes, of course, of Thomas Jefferson and other Republicans, allowed a central bank was really to handle the debt and fiscal issues after the War of 1812. The private Second Bank of the United States had an immediate impact. Now remember, it was 1816 it was put into place with the Panic of 1819. Really, it comes in, boom, we got a panic. Let's see how this came about. And it was due to the unrestrained issuing of paper money from the banks. And if you didn't know this, back then there was no paper currency. There was just coin currency for the United States. So paper currency was just bank notes. So every bank would issue a note, say, here's a note for $1,000, go spend it. If you ever want to bring it back to us, we'll give you $1,000 in gold and silver. Didn't quite happen that way, but that was the plan with these bank notes. So they just started unleashing this paper money, loaning money out at incredible interest rates. That's what they started doing. So to fix the problem that was occurring, the Young Bank was created, and it tightened the credit market for the state banks. And those were the banks that were pretty much creating all the bank notes. So if you can imagine, each state had its own bank notes for the state. Now, could you trade these? Probably. I'm sure some states accepted other ones. I mean, banks learned how to work with each other. But in the end, it was, there was a lot of currency running around out there, and it was getting heavily inflated. And it was basically not worth, you might get handed a $1,000 note, and a month from now it might be worth $700 because they had created so many more notes behind it and weren't really able to back it up. So it tightened the credit market for the state banks, and panic ensued like Nero playing his fiddle and watching Rome burn. In the end, the second Bank of the United States was a monopoly and had too much power. And we will get into that as we get close in on the conspiracy of the bankers. When its charter was, now we're going to step forward now. So that's basically what happened there. And we'll get a little bit more into it, but I want to get through, I need to explain some things to you about the second Bank of the United States. And you got to understand that after Andrew Jackson, of course, like I said, got elected in 1828, he was a bank hater. He hated the bank. He thought the bank was supported really all the northern merchants and didn't care about any of the southern or western farmers, the agriculture of our country, the majority of the people. So he really did not like the banks, and I can understand why. I mean, if they did a lot of things, including, if we didn't discuss this, and we're not going to get too big into tariffs, because tariffs are silly in my opinion, but the tariff of 1816 really hammered the South and did a lot of damage to the South, and along with the fact that when the War of 1812 ended, when you have a war, you're mass producing lots of stuff. So you have this incredibly awesome economy because everybody's pumping out stuff. Cotton's going everywhere because the country needs it. But then all of a sudden the war stops. No one wants your cotton. And then you have all these cotton farms that have sprung up over the years to make cotton for the war effort. And now there's no buyers for it. And of course, cotton crashes. That also led to the Panic of 1819. But when his charter was up for extension in 1832, of course, we all know, like I said, Jackson vetoed the charter, and in 1836, the bank was basically no more. While Nicholas Biddle, you're going to learn about him a lot in this, maybe not quite in this episode, but we'll talk about him throughout history. Nicholas Biddle, he looked to put up a fight, but in the end, the second bank was gone. Okay, so let's get to one of the biggest problems of the second Bank of the United States, and that was that many of the investors were foreigners. Foreigners. A.K.A. Rothschilds, and there's the rub. So if you have a private bank that controls the money of the country, and that private bank is made of private investors who basically, I believe like at the time, they got a share of stock for every $100 of gold they put in the bank or something like that, or $1,000 of gold, whatever it was. So of course the Rothschilds would come in and say, hey, we're going to dump in, $1 million of gold. Now we own the Bank of the United States. That could happen. Private investors, nobody really knew who the investors were. To this day, we don't even know who owns the Federal Reserve. Amazing to this day. So that means that foreign entities were able to not only control our monetary policies, but in fact our economy. So furthermore, with the dissolvement of the second Bank of the United States, you probably had some pissed off investors, a.k.a. Rothschilds. So you get rid of the bank. Maybe they were pissed off. Maybe they wanted you to get rid of the bank. I'm doing this with my shoulder. I'm going, I don't know. Because they're the ones who supported Jackson and the Democrats. They didn't have a problem with that. So maybe this is a bigger plan here, using Andrew Jackson, his ability to get things done, his dictatorship, king-like actions, and his temper against the banks would be a fantastic tool to get that done with. So, as we all know, the point of the, of course, Bank of the United States, was to funnel gold and silver from America back to England. Oh, you didn't know that? You didn't know that the whole point of the Bank of the United States was to take our gold and silver, which they're doing to this very day, and transporting it to the banks in England, in the city of London? I don't mean London, I mean the city of London, London City, whatever you want to call it. Really? That one's going to get some attention from some people. Okay. So this was the only face value, legitimate way to transfer wealth to the Rothschilds banking cartel. If you think about it, you can't just come and blow up everybody, because they tried to do that in the American Revolution and they lost. And the people of England were tired of the war. So now they said, we'll do it through financial means. We will put banks down there. We will force monetary policies on them. We will pick their presidents. And then we will funnel their money. But how do they do it? Let's find out how they got. And when I say America, I mean Mexico, I mean the United States, I mean Canada, I mean Latin America, and you can, if you want to, throw in South America. Because I promise you the Bank of America and other banks in Europe had their hands in all of those. So let's talk about this Rothschild banking cartel, otherwise known as, anybody? Bueller, the Bank of England. All right. Early Americans also feared that the Bank of England had secret investors in the first and second banks of the United States. They actually thought about this back then. Amazing. Or that they routinely caused panics or depressions in North America. In fact, the Panic of 1837 can actually indirectly be traced back to the Bank of England. This is the story that you've never heard. Let's tell it. So, how do we trace the Panic of 1837 back to the Bank of England? Well, insofar as how that bank raised its interest rates after silver shipments from Mexico to the United States dried up. See, there was a lot of silver going to the United States. Now, before I get into the rest of the story, I have to explain to you the theory of species, or as they call it, hard currency, gold and silver. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what Andrew Jackson did to precipitate this panic with his demand of gold and silver. But basically back then, which was actually the right way to do it, all currency was supposed to be backed by gold and silver. Now, it wasn't exactly that way. It was like 3-to-1, 5-to-1, whatever the bank decided to do as far as how much currency to produce against its gold and silver in reserve. But in order to produce more money and to have a stable economy, you need to have gold and silver backing your currency. Well, I just now told you, when the silver from Mexico dried up coming to America, they decided to raise their interest rates because they needed to generate more money and pull as much gold and silver as they could, because they were having problems keeping their own currency reserves up with the fact that all the gold and silver was leaving. Because remember, they're not the only ones who want gold and silver. China wants gold and silver. Russia wants gold and silver. The rest of Europe wants gold and silver. Everybody wants gold and silver. So, you have to get some and you have to spend some, and they were spending some on wars, and they needed to refill their coffers, and they were doing that. So let's get into the story again. Just want to make sure you understand the theory of species. Just like the word species, it's just called species, as in maybe there's a different letter in there. I doubt it though. But basically, it means gold and silver currency. So those shipments dried up. Thus, of course, it diminished the flow of silver from the United States to China. Now, this is the odd one. So the United States would take the silver from Mexico, and it sold its products to Mexico. So we traded. They gave us silver. We gave them our products, cotton, whatever it was they wanted to buy. And then we would take that silver and we would trade it to China. Then it would go from China onto England, where England used that silver as a reserve. So there you go. You just saw it. It's a quick little map of how our silver, or the silver we accrued through our hard work, eventually made it to England through China. So how did this all happen? Well, we'll get into it. Of course, however, at worst, the bank was an unwilling actor in really a story that begins in Mexico. Okay. Of course, the United States for a long time had imported silver from Mexico and other Latin American sources, and almost as quickly had exported to China and other Asian countries to pay for the Asian imports. We changed in a Jacksonian era was something largely unrelated to U.S. events. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. What changed in the Jacksonian era was something largely unrelated to U.S. events. The British, and they are very, very clever merchants, introduced, what do you call this? Opium. You guys are familiar with opium, right? They decided to introduce opium produced in their Asian dominions to the Chinese market. And suddenly the Chinese needed to pay the British for their new habit. Because the Americans were selling so much cotton to Britain, they built up claims in the form of bills of exchange. Obligations of British cotton importers to pay American cotton producers. With the Chinese, because of their opium imports, now in need of a way to pay the British opium merchants, Americans quickly realized that they no longer needed to carry silver to China to pay for imports of Chinese goods. They can substitute bills of exchange, drawn on British cotton imports for silver. And the Chinese would have nearly ideal way to pay for opium. The British merchants would receive payment and promises of their own countrymen to pay in pounds sterling. Okay, the net result of this substitution was that the Mexican silver swelled the U.S. monetary base. In what is perhaps the most memorable sentence, the most memorable thought that I'm going to give you out of this, because there's a lot of confusing stuff that I wrote down here about the Chinese. The bottom line is this. You go in and you have what's called the Opium Wars. And this is something that you've learned in history about how the British wanted to force opium that they made in Bengali, which is modern-day Afghanistan/Pakistan, which today still makes opium for the world. They took that money and they decided that they were going to, or that opium, they were going to force it on the Chinese. So they went to war with the Chinese government because the Chinese government said, hey, we don't want our people all hooked on and being lazy and hooked and dying on opium. And the British, with Queen Victoria, blew up the Chinese ports and said, yeah, you're going to take it. They also took Hong Kong at that time as well. And this is what they said. They said, hey, we're doing this, okay? We're doing this, and if you don't like it, go to war with us. Well, the Chinese couldn't do much against that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to enter the Rothschilds into this little mess, little massacre of silver and gold and Mexico and China and the United States. Let's bring in the Rothschilds. Here they come, more money. But this time, let's go from China to the UK. So the truth lies buried in the family line of David Sassoon. He's basically known as the Rothschilds of the Far East and their monopoly over the opium trade. So David Sassoon, an agent of the Rothschilds, was the one running the opium trade war. Britain, of course, won Hong Kong by launching, as I said, the colony of Hong Kong, by launching the Opium Wars to give Sassoon exclusive rights to the drug and to the entire nation. And in the beginning, Sassoon wanted to trade cotton cloth with China in exchange for tea, but the Chinese did not want cotton that Sassoon wanted to trade. At the same time, Britain had an really just had this appetite, this absolute insatiable appetite for Chinese tea. They wanted it. They desired it. But the current Qing dynasty and the Chinese people did not want to buy really nothing that the British produced. The Chinese were, however, willing to trade tea for silver. Of course, who doesn't want silver? And since at the time China had currency fully backed by silver, and of course that's why they liked it. They wanted the more silver China got, the more currency they could produce, the stronger their economy got. Makes a lot of sense, right? All right. But the government of Queen Victoria did not want to use up the country's reserves of gold and silver in simply buying tea. So Sassoon considered that the Chinese might be susceptible to opium, which could then be exchanged for tea. And he was right, and it all happened. Armed with that knowledge, he sailed back to England to make a new proposition to the Queen. And of course, on the advice of Sassoon, Queen Victoria decided to export opium from the Indian subcontinent to China. And of course, as you guys know, with the Opium Wars, she enforced it with the British Navy. In order to boost the trade, obviously Sassoon had to force the farmers in Bengali to stop producing valuable food for their people and turn into opium poppies. Of course, as you guys all know, Bengali, aka Afghanistan, has a perfect climate for growing opium, and Sassoon's business absolutely flourished. The first drug cartel was born. Not only did he become a member of the East India Trading Company, what we call it, the East India Company, a firm owned and run by the Rothschilds out of the city of London. So successful was the opium business that the tax from the East Indian Company alone that was paid to England paid for all the wars between 1831 and 1905. Every war they were in, just tax alone for the East India Company on the Opium Wars alone by itself took care of all those wars. So what all that story said was this. The bankers managed to transfer the wealth of America and Latin America to Britain through the Rothschilds banking empire. The goal of the Rothschilds banking cartel back then was to hold the species, aka gold and silver, as possible as back to their almighty currency, to back up. I'm sorry. I got mixed up my AKA there. The goal that they wanted to hold the species as long, to back up their almighty currency, which is of course the British pound, the sterling, all that stuff. It's a wonder that the British pound is still the most valuable currency on earth to this day. A lot of people out there think that the dollar is the most powerful piece of currency. In fact, it's not even the second most powerful. That, to what I know of, it's the third most powerful behind the euro and the pound. For if you had $1 American dollar and traded in for British pounds, you'd get 69 cents of a British pound. So it's worth 31% less this day. So it's kept very powerful, and that's because the Rothschilds have all the gold and silver. It's able to keep powerful. So what I just described to you is their way of doing business. They couldn't get the Chinese to give them the silver that the Chinese were getting from the Americas, so they turned around and put the Chinese on drugs and got all the money anyways from it. But how did the panic of 1830? Let's go back now to the panic. I told you that story about what was going on around the world at that time, and that was all occurring in the early 1830s. So now we jump back up to 1837. And what really happened after Jackson's great move to remove the bank? So we talked about this. We talked about he removed the bank, but what were the ramifications after he vetoed their charter? Well, number one, he started, of course, pulling funds into his pet banks, state banks, otherwise known as. And then he did which I thought was a pretty bad thing, the Distribution Act of 1836, which, of course, was spearheaded by one of his boys, Henry Clay, to provide a system for distributing federal surpluses to state banks and restricting legal tender to gold and silver. Uh-oh, not a lot of that around, apparently. This plan received, of course, support by those who wanted to quickly replace the functions performed by the Bank of the United States, but supporters of hard money like gold and silver opposed the bill, fearing speculative banking and the contraction of the money supply. And there's where the problem occurs, is you contract the money supply. Another thing that he did that really caused problems is he signed an executive order, Andrew Jackson, stating that he didn't want to sell any more public lands with banknotes. And here's why. He was selling a bunch of land of the United States of America, and he had all this paper. People were paying with paper. And he knew he couldn't take all this paper to a bank and get gold and silver because there wasn't enough gold and silver to cover it all. So he then ordered, he goes, hey, if you want to buy land, guess what? You got to buy the gold and silver. Well, there wasn't enough gold and silver to go around, as the story goes. So when there's not enough gold and silver to go around, what happens? People stop buying land. Land value significantly drops. People, if they do want to buy land, try to pull gold and silver out of banks. When the people who are able to buy land, the rest of them can't. Well, the federal government depended on the money of land sales to pay for the government. When the government wasn't getting the money, then the government needed to borrow more money, and insanity ensues. Which, by the way, in 1835, of course, as you know, in 1835, he paid off the national debt, but it quickly went back into debt, and by 1837, we were back into massive debt because we had to borrow money from, of course, the banks, which go figure what banks we borrow that money from. I don't know, but we'll have to figure it out. It probably has something to do with the Rothschilds, I'll tell you that right now. So, of course, properties are in the foreclosure because when you start to have what's called deflation, which occurred in 1819 as well, and the money supply contracts because banks start to tighten their loaning. And the banks didn't even want their paper anymore. They were getting sick of, writing a bank note for $1,000 and then it being worth God knows what by the time they get it back. They didn't want that no more. They tightened the restrictions on loaning. All of a sudden, there wasn't a lot of money out there. The money supply completely, contracted, and deflation occurred. And now you have this great panic, which led to one of the greatest depressions. Unemployment was in the high 25-26% of the country. Could not find jobs. Soup kitchens were opened. People were starving. This was massive, and this went on for 7 years until the country can pull itself out of it. So what was Jackson's role in all this? Was he innocent, or did he really just hate the banks? Or was he an agent of the bankers doing their bidding? I believe that Jackson was a pawn, okay, in a game played by the bankers. That the bankers allowed and, in fact, supported Jackson to the presidency. By Jackson winning, they knew that he would try to stop the charter and that there would be, and that would be their chance to strike. And that's where the Panic of 1837 occurs. You can't be shocked to know that the Panic of 1837 wasn't much different from the Panic of 1819. When you contract the amount of money available in the economy and you don't have gold and silver to back it up, recessions and problems will occur. The U.S. National Bank was supposed to prevent these kind of economic downturns, but it didn't, right? I mean, right? Happened twice, of course. Whenever the banks have control over the money, they can do what they want. Corruption is allowed to happen, and problems occur. There's actually a famous quote attributed to Thomas Jefferson. Now, he likely didn't say this as is, more of a combination of things he says, but, because I tried to fact-check this quote, but I think it's just somebody pulled together several things he said. But he stated, if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Let me tell you something that couldn't be more true. And here's why. When the banks went into deflation, they called in their loans. Farmers lost their land, farmers lost their farms, farmers lost their homes. Factories shut down, factories went to the banks. It was a massive land grab for the banks. The banks got them. Those banks failed. Well, somebody has to pick up the scraps of those banks. Other banks picked up the scraps of those banks. And in the end, somebody got rich off the whole caboodle. So did that happen? So that all really happened in 1819 and 1837, really? Well, of course it did. Both those panics were preceded by the contraction of money in the system, aka deflation. That contraction of money occurred because of the bank policies, purely. Remember, the banks don't lose money. They just waste it. That's the facts. Both panics, like I said, concerned all these bank loans. And if you want me to know, I'm talking about bank loans. But the banks gave loans to anyone back then with, who wanted them. I mean, they didn't like check credit back then. It wasn't like Experian back then. So they would just give them, but they would have charged these incredibly high interest rates to make their money, and people were able to pay them. Others weren't. But after the Bank of the U.S. overextended its credit back in 18, it decided to fix the problem, like I said, and it just starts calling in loans. Just does it. Does it. Crazy, awesome, grand. That's going to cause a problem. In 1818, there were 392 banks in the country. So there was a lot of money and many banknotes to go around. Just to give you an idea, in 1811, there was only like 88. So within 7 years, we basically quadrupled the number of banks. So another problem that both panics involved was the move westward. The expansion westward, generated a lot of money for the United States government in selling land, generated a lot of land that was now able to be used to produce materials and crops for the people and for the country to sell. So it did a lot of good for them. But like with all things, when you get dependent on it, it can become a problem later for you. For example, land in Alabama went, and this is back in the 1819 era, you can get an acre of land in Alabama for like $150, but by the time that Panic of 1819 struck and money was contracted and deflation occurred, that land value deflated to 10%. Or $10 an acre. So you can't sit here and think that deflation is always good. When prices go down, people lose jobs, companies shut down, bad things happen. You can't have massive deflation, which right now we're in a deflationary period with oil. If you haven't noticed, oil used to be $4.50 a gallon. Now it's down to $2.50 a gallon here in Nevada. I'm not sure what it is everywhere else, but at one point it was like $4.25 a gallon. So if deflation has occurred and the price of oil has dramatically dropped by almost 50%. And that's where we stand. So, and that's where I'm pretty much going to put a ribbon on this show, because the next show, we're going to be done with this stuff. I've explained to you now, and I'm going to recap, where the Rothschilds came into play, as they've always been. Since 1743, they have been involved in all aspects of banking. And they have, along with the support of the monarchies, especially the one in England with Queen Victoria, wanted to continue their reign of supremacy, not only over the United States, but over the entire world. If you remember, the sun never set on the British Empire. And in order to do that, they had to control the gold and silver of the world. He who controls that will control the world. And for a while there, America, later on in its history, especially at post-World War II, had a lot of the gold of the world. And we believe a lot of that gold's in Fort Knox, but it really isn't. I think we're all pretty clear that there's no gold in Fort Knox. But even if there was, it wouldn't amount to the vast amount. It wouldn't be as much as the vast amount that is located in the Rothschilds' banking institutes. They're going to do whatever they want to control and manipulate us. They're going to elect our presidents. They're going to force opium on China. They're going to go to war with us for no apparent reason. I mean, you can never really explain why we fully went to war against Britain in 1812, but we did, and who benefited from that but the bankers. They got their panic. They got their second bank of the United States. They got their second bank torn away, so which they then got the panic of 1837, which they then got the United States to go back and borrow from them and become one of their biggest borrowers to this day. We've never been out of debt since 1835. They got their win there. So on the next show, we're going to get into the Act of 1871, which basically formed Washington, D.C., and as most believe, incorporated the United States for the banks. Because, hey, you got to be a corporation. But we're also going to delve back into the United States history as far as Reconstruction and really how the Democratic Party and the Republican Party formed their battle lines. Because this is one of the most confusing times in U.S. history. People think in the 1870s and 80s, and we're going to get into President Garfield, by the way, who was also assassinated by bankers. He's another anti-banker who was assassinated. We'll talk about him next show, too. Because, he tried to take up against the bankers, and he went down in a heartbeat. But the bankers, the robber barons, whatever you want to call these elitists, had a mission, okay? Their mission was always, hey, we want the wealth. We want to transfer the wealth from America to England. If you look at it, they did it in every colony they ever had. They transferred the wealth. I mean, and Spain did this too. Spain absolutely decimated all of their colonies, took all the wealth, left them nothing, took all the silver, then gold they can get out of South America and left, and that's why they're all poor colonies. England didn't quite do that bad, but they still sucked a lot out of their colonies. But, many nations ripped apart Africa for its natural resources and its gold and diamonds. They ripped it apart and left. They didn't care. Why do you think they would be different about the United States of America? We were colonies to the great island of England. They still think they rule the world, and they don't. But they think they do. And the reason why they think they can do that is because they've incorporated the United States of America. And what we're going to get into, and one of the nice conspiracy theories that people like to talk about, is the incorporation of the United States of America with the Act of 1871, and the fact that basically that turns your birth certificate into a legal documentation that says you're owned by the banks. Yeah, you now have a birth certificate. Furthermore, in the 1930s, I think 1938 to be exact, I'll have to check that though, Roosevelt gave us a number. Well, I mean, you should have a number. I mean, you can't just have a piece of paper, a certificate saying that you are a tax-paying citizen of this nation and you will pay taxes to your rich bankers that you owe the money to. They're your you're their property. They're the ones who are making your debt-based monetary system by giving you your banknotes. Hey, if you want to be able to have banknotes to spend, you better pay taxes to pay for those banknotes, and that's what we do. And I think the Act of 1871 will help clear that up a little bit. And, of course, I think by episode 6, we'll definitely be into the World War II era and that Great Depression era, which is going to be a fantastic era to talk about. But the next episode, we're going to get into Reconstruction. And really, there's not a lot to talk about. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the early 20th century. But as far as I'm concerned, it's not nearly as critical as what happened, 1907 to 1913. That's what I really want to talk about. So we're going to cover Reconstruction. Then we're going to skip ahead a little bit because, Roosevelt, McKinley, all that, very fascinating. Maybe I'll tell a story or two about that. But in essence, we're going to start moving really quickly because once we get to modern times, you're going to be just totally disgusted. If you're not disgusted already, you're going to really be disgusted by what goes on in the later episodes of not only of our history, but of the show, of course, and the absolute bullshit that is portrayed on the American people as we get our wealth sucked from us. We always think we're the wealthiest country in the world. And the only reason that we are and we were the wealthiest country in the world is because of all of our wonderful, great natural resources that we're able to produce all those resources to take all that money, and then all that money gets pulled right away from us. And now, magically, instead of being the richest nation on the world, we're the nation with the largest national debt of almost $20 trillion. Of course, the Rothschilds can pay that off. They're worth an estimated $200 trillion, so I guess they could pay it off if they really wanted to. But they like having that debt. Because having that debt means you and I and everybody else listening to podcasts, well, guess what? We're the ones who have to sit there and pay that debt. We're the ones, when you see that money taken out of your paycheck that you earned, that money is going to pay the interest on the national debt, which goes to the Federal Reserve, which goes to the private investors who own the Federal Reserve, which are, and I guarantee you, there's 12 banks, and I guarantee you more than one of those banks are owned by the Rothschilds in the city of London. All right, I'm Todd Farino. I want to thank you for listening. I hope I didn't mumble things up too much. I try not to. I have notes for these shows, and I apologize. Sometimes I'm trying to stay on track because I have a little time limit here. I do try to stay on track and try to keep things flowing. So if I stumble sometimes in my notes, I apologize. I'm used to not having actual notes for a show and just have it all in my head. But this is a story that has to be told in the right way, and so I make sure I have them. But I want to thank you all for listening. We will see you back next week for episode 5 of The Great Deception, The Conspiracy for a Counter-Revolution. Thank you all for joining me tonight, and I will see you next week.